Good morning, everybody. I'm Esma Day, one of the impact managers at BARHII and Rise Together. It's great to have you all here for our webinar on guaranteed income and community resilience, both during COVID-19 and beyond. It's great to have everybody. Can everyone see my screen okay? Can I get some thumbs up or? Great, awesome. Okay. So I think we have a lot of folks online. We normally do like a check-in question, but I don't think we'll have time for everybody to respond, but it would be great to know who is all with us. So if you all could just maybe type in the chat your name, your organization, and then we can get to know you all just a little bit. A lot of public health folks with us today. Great. For 5. Awesome. For those just joining, if you want to put in your name, organization, so we know who you are. Wonderful. Okay, we'll go over a couple housekeeping things before we get started, while you all continue to introduce yourselves over the chat. So clearly a lot of you are familiar with the chat function, which is great. We would love if you can provide reactions as well. So on the bottom right of your Zoom screen, if you're logging in using your computer, you should see a reactions button. And you have either a clap or a thumbs up, and feel free to use those throughout the presentations today. And if you are not speaking, I'd kindly ask to mute yourselves. I know it's hard to remember that sometimes, and we've had a couple interesting incidents in the past. So just a quick reminder on that. I do have Melanie on the line with me. She'll be helping me a lot with the back end of things. She'll be helping me field some Q&A questions, if anyone's raising their hand, things like that. So thank you in advance, Melanie. And for those who are just joining, feel free to add your name and your organization. That's basically our check-in question today. Okay, before we get started with an overview of the agenda, any burning questions, concerns? Wonderful. Okay. So quick overview today, we're here for about an hour and a half. The objectives of today's webinar are to explore the potential role of universal basic income or guaranteed income on COVID-19 recovery. I think it's a really interesting time to be having this conversation. We'd also be aiming to identify federal, statewide, and countywide policy efforts to advance guaranteed income policies and initiatives. We'd also like to share a Bay Area County pilot and their results on what UBI could look like if it were to be enacted. And then last but not least, determining opportunities and concerns for any of you all from local governments today who have questions about enacting similar initiatives in your counties. We have a wonderful, wonderful group of panelists with us today. They're each highly respected professionals in their fields, and they'll be talking to us about the respective levels of government that we will be addressing today. So we'll get started today with a conversation around what is happening on the national and federal level with guaranteed income. And that conversation will be led today by Natalie Foster from the Economic Security Project. We'll then delve into a more zoomed in California statewide view, and that conversation will be led by Ann Price, who's the president of the Insight Center. And there's a slight tweak in the agenda today. We'll actually be jumping to Stockton's pilot first because I know Suki with us will have a hard stop at 10 a.m. And so she'll be talking to us about the SEED project, which is the pilot that they have been working on in Stockton, which is really, really exciting. And then we'll have Larissa with us to talk us through some opportunities for Bay Area County level guaranteed income policies. And so thank you in advance to all of our speakers for being here, and I'm super, super excited to have you all. What we'll do is we'll have each speaker go for about 7 to 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the line for about 5 minutes of Q&A. Feel free to ask your questions by unmuting yourself, and if folks start to talk over each other, we can start using the raise hand function. You can see that if you go to the chat, and on the very far right of the chat, you should see 3 dots. If you click on the 3 dots, you should see a raise hand function, and you can click that, and Melanie will be helping me to field those. Otherwise, feel free to ask your question in the chat. Whatever questions we don't get to for each speaker, we'll open up towards the very end for about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So don't worry about that. We'll definitely get to your question one way or another. Any quick questions before we continue? Okay, some background. For those who are not familiar with us, BARHII is the coalition of the Bay Area County health departments, and we recently merged with Rise Together. That is a coalition to end poverty back in August of 2019. Since the shelter in place happened in California, we have been actively responding to COVID-19 and came up with collectively a designed platform of policy priorities for us. And the pillars upon which the platform stands are health equity, economic opportunity, and racial justice. That's kind of the guiding principles for our recovery and response so far. And one of the priorities that the group landed on was there was a real need for strategizing around cash, getting cash to families. And this was a theme over and over and over again that we have seen. And so this webinar is a continuation of that conversation, where we look at guaranteed income as one potentially very, very effective way to get cash to families' hands that need it most right now. So without further ado, I'll introduce Natalie Foster. Natalie, are you with us on the line today?
Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome. Natalie joins us from the Economic Security Project. She is the co-chair and co-founder. I'll let you do a bit more intro, Natalie, for yourself and your organization, but please take it away. And also, would you like me to, is this screen okay, or do you want me to stop sharing my screen so you can share any slides?
No, that screen's great.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here, and it's great to see what a great, this is a great group as I'm looking through the folks I know and the folks I don't know, but the organizations I do. So it's just really a wonderful way to start the day on what is an otherwise very difficult and terrible week. I think I speak for many of us. So I want to start by telling the story of Tomas, which I hope isn't scooping Suki later, because she has so many great stories. But Tomas lives in Stockton, and like so many people, when the crisis hit, he was in the middle of an exciting job transition. He had gotten his first managerial track job at an airport, and COVID hit, and everything was on pause, and Tomas lost his job. But unlike the 36 million other Americans who've also lost their jobs and are currently figuring it out, Tomas had a $500 a month income because he was part of Stockton's seed program. And that meant for this past, 10, 12 months, he had been receiving $500 a month as a pilot to show what a guaranteed income could do in people's lives. That was actually how he'd had the space to go find a job that was the type of job he'd always wanted, but hadn't actually had the space to do it. And I think I tell that story not because everything's great with Tomas, because it's not, but that he had a baseline of resilience through the guaranteed income by participating in the program that was not like other folks in his demographic. And that resilience is something that everyone should have. That baseline of economic resilience is something that we could absolutely create for American families if we wanted to. And I would argue we now have to, given the situation that we're in. Long before, obviously, the COVID crisis, there was a human-made crisis of an economy that did not work for most people. We've had 50 years of a capitalism that made the rich richer and everybody else with less. We have a quarter before COVID, right? A quarter of the American workforce worked full-time, but was on some form of public assistance because wages simply didn't pay the bills. You couldn't raise a family and pay rent with one job in America. We knew most families couldn't scrape together $400. And we knew that the wealth of a white family was 10 times more than the wealth of a Black family. It's just one example of the great racial disparities in our past 50 years of neoliberal capitalism. And so there we were with an economy that didn't work for most people, and an understanding that big ideas were needed to solve very big problems, that we could no longer tinker around the edges if we wanted to make sure that people could eat, take care of their children, pay their rent, and have a good education and healthcare. That something big had to change. And there were lots of changes needed, right? Like that's an important thing here. I think a guaranteed income is very important, but it alone does not solve the problems. There's a whole set of reforms needed out there. But I do believe that an income floor is uniquely important for ensuring that people have what they need to take care of themselves and their families and their communities. And we know that. For years, we have been studying what happens when people receive cash. And Suki will give you really exciting results coming out of Stockton. But Suki knows too that we're building on top of so much literature, that birth weights go up, that people stay in school longer, that stress levels go down. And we now know, and you all know more than anyone, the impact that chronic stress can have on people's lives. And so, study after study showed that cash really has a huge impact on people's lives. And so the time had come to pick up what Dr. King talked about in his last book, Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, when he argued for a guaranteed income as a way to eradicate poverty, that it's the type of idea that we needed in America. And I think that moment in the United States has where we have a situation so precarious that we need to be ensuring monthly checks to people across the country. And so the interesting thing is that in the last 9 weeks, we've gone from this idea being the type of thing that really only is being demonstrated in Stockton and a few other, Jackson, Mississippi, and a few other pilots, to all of a sudden federal bills written to create a guaranteed income. There are 9 bills by our last count in Congress between the House and the Senate that would create monthly checks for people. Most of them are $2,000 a month until the economic crisis is over. So Senator Kamala Harris teamed up with Ed Markey from Massachusetts and Senator Bernie Sanders to write the bill in the Senate. And then there are several in the House, like Representative Rashida Tlaib has a bill that would create $2,000 a month for everyone. That one's universal. It creates a new bank account at the Federal Reserve that everyone would get as a way of sort of instituting public banking. There's a bill that Representative Ro Khanna teamed up with Tim Ryan, and that's an interesting sort of Bernie and Biden Democrat type coalition to also create monthly checks for people. And then you have a Republican out of Missouri who has a bill that creates monthly checks for people. The bottom line is, one check was not enough in this economic recovery. And it is important to create robust unemployment insurance options, to shore up small businesses. All of the programs are very important, but cash can move very quickly. Everyone needs it. It's fungible. People can use it on the things they need it most. And it isn't tied to employment, which means that people don't fall through the cracks. People who traditionally have had, unemployment, who have had employment that is not, that is not traditional, non-traditional employment, often fall through the cracks of the system. And so checks get to the most people. Now, there's still lots of work to do to figure out how we, include, for example, undocumented families who were totally left out of the first round of stimulus checks from the federal government. And so lots more work to do, but I think we now have a precedent where, the IRS just sent hundreds of billions of dollars to Americans over the course of 9 weeks with that first check. And it's a good reminder that it can do that fast. It can print checks, it can move them out to folks, and that can really change people's lives. And so we need to be doing that on a regular basis, as the stance that we take at Economic Security Project. So I think that's the federal sort of view that this has gone from an idea and white papers, important white papers that Anne Price has written, who we'll hear from in a second, the types of demonstrations that Suki has run, who we'll hear from in a second, to actual bills in Congress in 9 weeks, to the IRS moving checks to people within weeks. We know that we can move at light speed if the political will is there. This has never been a problem of who will pay for it, how it will happen. It's always been a problem of political will, and that has been demonstrated so clearly over the past several weeks. So now our job is to keep pushing, and this is where I think that public health departments can play a really important role, because you are such trusted messengers, and the thin line between the economic health and the physical health has been erased. And you are the people who can say that most clearly and loudly. So I guess my one big thing would be say that from the rooftops. And I know you have been, but keep doing it, because people have, I think, different ears now and can hear in a different way. It's almost like we're in a moment with a black light. Those of us who could see what was there, it was there. But now the black light makes it even clearer to those who couldn't see before. And so I think the work you do is incredibly important. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what is possible locally, because I do think more demonstrations of this idea, more public-private work to demonstrate what's possible, all adds up to the pressure we need to do this at the federal level. And I think we have to do it in tandem. We have to be working at the local level now, and at the federal as well. So I can stop there, and if there's anything in particular you want me to hit on, I'd love to do that.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Does anyone have any questions for Natalie right away? I think we have one in the chat. Oh, I think someone is unmuted and needs to mute. There's some static in the background. We have a comment in the chat from when you were speaking, Natalie. As a housing specialist, I agree you're right. Having an income floor is a great idea, and it helps to relieve pressures of life so that people can have a peaceful existence. I encourage all my clients to be certain that they are able to take care of themselves. I remind them of what most grandparents did in the past. Not only did they have a regular job, they also had a hustle that brought in a nice amount of supplemental income.
Yeah, so I think the link between guaranteed income and housing is one that we need to explore even more, particularly in California. I think that's the way you could imagine creating a real guaranteed income in California, is to ensure that it keeps people in their houses and helps pay the rent. But I also think it's important, like part of the way we need to ask this question is, what do we owe one another? Not just how can everyone sort of figure it out. One of the challenges of this is that it can be framed as a very individualistic idea, right? Like everybody needs their own so that they can take care of themselves. And in fact, I think this policy is, what do we owe one another? What do we as a society say we want to do as the richest nation on earth in the richest moment in history? That we want to create an economic resilience for everyone, right? That we want to make sure people have access to healthcare and housing and public education and so forth. So I think that's absolutely right, and I think we should keep asking that question: what do we owe one another?
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Natalie?
Yeah, so there's a question about the local budgets. So this is real. So our theory of change at Economic Security Project, and I should give you a little history. We launched about 4 years ago with the idea that there was a lot of momentum around what then I think of as sort of a universal basic income, but not a whole lot of like understanding of what it could be, what it would look like, how would you do it, where would you implement it? So we launched with advisors like Anne and Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton and others to answer that question for this moment in time. How would you, because there was a moment in American history where this almost passed under President Nixon, actually, and then it's sort of just been forgotten about. So in this moment, how would you how would you create it? And so our theory was we would use the laboratories of democracy. Cities and states would be the place that would experiment with this idea, prove its possibility and efficacy, prove that it has a profound impact on people, of lowering stress, creating space in their lives, giving them back time. That's a really powerful thread from the work Suki's doing in Stockton, is how much people talk about the time that $500 a month bought them to spend with their family, to participate in their community, spend time with their kids, what pre-COVID, whatever it was. And so we felt like, it would, the local level would all eventually ladder up to something at the federal level. But I think in the last 9 weeks, that's been flipped, that cities and states will be so strapped that they will simply be covering our basics. And it's the federal government will have to provide a guaranteed income if it's to happen in a robust way for most people. And so that's why we've aimed all of our work at the federal level, and really ensuring that Speaker Pelosi sees this as something that she wants to take on, right? We're not quite there yet. While there's a number of bills and a lot of champions, including much of the California delegation, Speaker Pelosi's talked about this, but hasn't included it yet in the Democratic bill in the House. And so there's still a lot of work to do there. But I think that's right. And that's the reason why the federal government has to do this, because the cities and states will be in one of the hardest hit moments. And then one question about the difference between a universal basic income and a guaranteed income. I think it's simply who receives the check. There's one version of this that everyone would get the check, which Rashida Tlaib, Representative Tlaib, has a bill that would do that, with the idea being that universal programs are very, they're harder to dismiss. They have a lot of political resilience, and that there's a sort of we're all in this together kind of a sense. We, after a lot of work, decided that that there's a way you could get checks to people who need it the most, and that would have that would have the biggest impact on racial equity, and would allow for it to sit alongside other interventions that are needed, like a guaranteed health care, guaranteed housing, that sort of thing. And so that the guarantee was really the radical idea. That was the idea that challenged modern capitalism, that said you are worth more than just what the labor market will pay you, that you have an inherent worth, and we're going to guarantee a baseline of income, in addition to the wages you earn and the jobs you have, and that sort of thing. So that's sort of where we landed on a guaranteed income.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll take one more question that I see in the chat, and then we will move on. Which voices among Republicans are supporting this, and which frames, oh, I just lost it. Which frames can reach across the aisle in this divided environment?
So it's Representative Hawley from Missouri, who has, or Senator Hawley from Missouri, who has a bill that would ensure monthly checks to American families who need it the most. Mitt Romney has come out in support of this idea. There's a number of Republicans, small number of Republicans who have joined that caucus. But it still seems to largely be the idea that one check on both sides of the aisle. Let's be clear. I don't want to make sure I'm not painting too rosy of a picture at the federal level. On both sides of the aisle, the dominant sense is still one check was, not necessarily was enough, but that's all we're going to do. Despite the fact that you have the chairman of the Federal Reserve going into Congress and saying, I need you to spend money on the American people. It is the only way we shore up the economy. So despite that and many, many other indicators that we need to be doing more in this crisis, that's still the response. So our work's cut out for us. And in terms of what frames, I think that, actually, I think I would love to hear what Anne says about that. Because she's really the expert on narrative who I turn to with questions like that. So right now, the frame is really, about the fact that people can't work, that 36 million people have filed for unemployment, you know, that we're in a crisis. It's very sort of momentary. And I think one of the challenges will be, how do we, as we transition out of this, you know, how do we make the case that this is something needed, you know, for the long term, that American families need, you know, a resilience floor, in order to make it, that they need stability, right? That income volatility before COVID was in itself a huge crisis. Month to month, you didn't know if you could pay the rent. And now that is, you know, true more than ever. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. I think we had a couple more questions that we will get to either in Q&A if they're not still answered by other speakers, so hold on to those. Thanks again, Natalie, for joining us. That was a great overview of what's happening at the federal level. It's really exciting that this work has penetrated that level. So thank you. Next up, we have Ann Price with us. Ann is the president of the Insight Center. And if my slides will keep up with me. Great. And she's joining us today to talk more about the California landscape of guaranteed income. She's done a lot of work on this, as Natalie has alluded to earlier, with a lot of great publications that have been really the foundation for a lot of this work. So Anne, would you like me to share your slides from my screen? If you're talking, you might be muted. I can't hear you. I can't. Can anybody else hear her? It might just be me. Okay. No, we can't hear you.
Oh, she's connecting right
Yes,
there.
your audio is connecting. You might just have to play charades.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yay, yes we can.
Yeah, sorry, I got kicked out of audio there. So sorry,
That's
that
okay.
was pretty anticlimactic after Natalie's speech.
It's okay, the anticipation is great.
Well, thank you. You can share the slides in just 1 minute, but I'd love for you to do that from your computer. That would be great.
Great, I will do that right now.
Great.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you know, I was.
Okay, I guess, are we ready?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just pulling it up.
Okay, well, let me just start. I want to say thank you, Natalie. I'm always kind of like, she always kind of drops the mic, and after following up with after her is always difficult because she really brings truth to power. And thank you for that, Natalie. And I really want to just say, for a person who's worked on poverty-related issues for over 30 years prior to even welfare reform, I really see the work that's being done now to think about income in very, very, you know, ways that are going to be most transformative. It's really, really key. I haven't really seen this in 30 years, mainly because so many of our federal policies have really been stuck. We've kind of certainly have tinkered around the edges of looking at child tax credits and EITC for sure, but we have not had anything truly transformative in terms of income. And so the wins that have been achieved by ESP have been pretty monumental in my book in terms of where we are in this country. So thank you, Natalie, for your leadership on that. I want to talk from a perspective of someone who works on racial equity, why I think cash and a guaranteed income is so important. And really it has to do with several things, but just the fact that this really just isn't about a pandemic, as Natalie said. This has really been a permanent feature of our economy. And so when you think about certainly the convergence of the precarity of work, having work hours that fluctuate, income volatility as a result of that, that this has become such a permanent part of our economy, and why I think a guaranteed minimum income can help us address and mitigate some of the deepest structural issues of our economy. I also think that it allows us to do something that I think is hugely important, and that is to interrogate the narrative of deservedness. And Natalie spoke a bit about this. This idea that you have to earn dignity, that you have to earn being and existing, really, on this planet, which really feeds into so many of our economic policies, certainly our social safety net, our programs and policies. And that issue around deservedness is so deeply racialized, and it certainly is an issue that is focused on class. This idea that people don't work hard enough, this idea that they're lazy, that they're trying to scam a system, is really, really undergirds all of our kind of economic policies that could make a difference in people's lives. But also, I think about what this means for communities of color in ways that we don't really talk about in kind of our economic policies, and that is how the push and pulls of these things around debt and the precarity of work, how they affect family members, and how families come together and help other family members. And this kind of push and pull makes a huge difference in kind of the fragility of families. I give this example of someone who works on wells. A lot of times we have seen that families of color will actually pull money out of their retirement savings to bury someone, to buy a headstone for someone. And these types of kinds of family needs are kind of hidden in our conversations about income and about wealth, but they are the realities and lived realities of people's lives. We know that the Black middle class, for example, loses about 27% of its wealth because they help other family members out. So imagine that cash, as you can even see now, can really help families mitigate those emergencies. It means that one family is not helping another family member out with $400 and $500. Natalie talked about issues of toxic stress. There's other issues that are important: civic participation, less involvement with the criminal legal system, a whole host of things that I think are really critical that could transform our country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few cash programs in the state, and really want to lay out why I think this is something that can be done at multiple levels, whether it's a national level, as Natalie said, a city level, we will speak to that in Stockton, county level, and what it can actually help solve. Okay, so let me start by talking about a cash program and experiment that's happening in Santa Monica, California. And this really came out of the fact that although there is rent control, that seniors in that county were really, really struggling on the margins, right? That they were finding that seniors were actually skipping meals, that they were not fulfilling kind of medical prescriptions. They were doing things like selling their parking lot space to just be able to buy food and things like that. And so it became a real issue. They certainly, officials in the county certainly felt that they could not afford for older adults to become homeless. And this is actually meaning that even small increases in rent were really pushing people closer to homelessness. So a pilot project was initiated about a couple of years ago there. It's a 14-month experiment giving cash to about 24, 25 seniors to keep them housed. These were really low-income seniors making less than $14,000 a year. And the real goal was to try to bring their income up to about $22,000 annually. And so this is just an example of an approach that is very targeted, that is really trying to address a deep social issue, and is really kind of mitigating a potentially very, very harmful situation and thinking about increasing homelessness among older adults. So that's one type of initiative that's happening. Next slide. I'm going to go back. Can you go back? There's a first slide I think didn't get shown before I go into this one. I want to talk about another pilot that's taking place here in the Bay Area. And I know that some of you that are in the health space are familiar with expecting justice. And it really is an approach that's looking at birth outcomes for Pacific Islander and Black women. And that really came out of really understanding that mother mortality rates and infant mortality rates were really high among these populations, that it was really a crisis that had to be mitigated. So Abundant Birth Project is just one aspect of work that's being done to help improve birth outcomes for low-income women who are struggling the most in San Francisco. And the idea of this project is to provide 100 Black and Pacific Islander pregnant women with monthly cash stipends ranging between $1,000 and $1,500. And the stipend is to last throughout the duration of the pregnancy and the first 2 months of a baby's life. And so this is like another idea of someone, of a group of folks who really saw an immediate need, built a body of work, and really saw cash as a way to help mitigate really negative health outcomes for its population. So that's another type of pilot that's happening in the Bay Area. Okay, now we can go to the final slide. I'm going to bring in another project that's not happening here in California, but is happening in Mississippi that Natalie touched upon, and it's the Magnolia Mothers Trust. And this has gotten a great deal of media attention across the nation. And it really is a pilot to help single mothers in Jackson, Mississippi, improve their life outcomes by receiving $1,000 a month for 12 months. And for many of these women, this is almost like doubling their income. So it's a really big cash infusion. And I think that some of the things that, that are starting to come out of that work really does show what a difference it makes to really bump up income. So you're really seeing, and talking about the Santa Monica approach, and this approach really moving people's income levels up. I think that one of the most important things about this pilot is the fact that not only is it really helping struggling mothers, of course, that's really hugely important in Mississippi particularly, but how it interrogates the issue of deservedness when you think about Black women, and the idea of a welfare queen that's predicated around Black women, of them being promiscuous, of them being lazy, and all the things that really have led to and shaped our public benefit system is really predicated on narratives around Black women. And this program in itself really digs into that narrative and really showing what it means to trust families to make the best decisions for themselves, and that through that you can really see some huge outcomes. These mothers talk about the fact that they were able to take their children to the beach for the first time, is one example, that they were able to go to a family reunion. And these things, what I mentioned in terms of racial justice, are hugely important to families of color, to be with family, to be able to celebrate family, and to be shut out of that is really huge and isolating for families of color. I really believe that a guaranteed minimum income in cash allows people it gives us meaning to the life that we were meant to live, right? It gives greater meaning. It not only shows us what we owe each other, but it allows us to live our lives with greater freedom of choice, with greater ability to mitigate the precariousness of work in a way that works best for our families. I want to say one thing about this Magnolia Mothers Trust. For some of you, I saw a couple of workforce people on this webinar. We've been doing some work in Mississippi ourselves and really looking at how people of color are truly locked out of job opportunities. So this work, which is really talking about occupational segregation, which is really the unnatural packing of people into certain jobs, right? And so when we really looked at that in Mississippi, we found that Black women are locked out of 62% of jobs. That means there's really no chance of them having earnings that will allow them to take care of their families. It's so deeply structural that women, Black women particularly in Mississippi, are struggling, mainly because of the jobs that they are in, how they're locked out of those jobs, and how a social safety net system is built on anti-Blackness, and that also locks them out of opportunities. It locks them out of childcare subsidies, for example. So you can think about cash and a guaranteed minimum income in so many ways across so many programs, thinking about how it helps people get through job training, thinking how it helps community college students get through college and earn a certification or a degree. So I'm going to stop there, but I think it's really important for us to know that there are real opportunities to do this at multiple levels. The program in Santa Monica was done with $300,000 of general fund money, right? And so there are, certainly philanthropic efforts mixed with government funds that are coming together to try to build out some of these pilots. So I'll stop there, see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Anne. I think we'll take just one question for now so that Suki can go before she has to leave right at 10, if that's okay. And then we will circle back to the other questions at the end during the open Q&A. So let's start with, that is a bit more general. How do you know how support was generated to fund these programs? Curious on the messaging to reach those empowered to fund the programs.
Yeah, so I just mentioned the use of general funds in one case, and there's kind of been more of a philanthropic, I would say, effort for some of the pilots right now. I have talked to people across the country who are doing some of these, and I will say a couple of them are doing them a little bit on the down low, and using funds from banks, foundations, and other foundations. I think the biggest issue here is this idea of deservedness and the fact that that messaging is so huge, right? It's so predominant. When we think about what's happened in the pandemic, one reason people have opened up their thinking is because they're seeing that there's no possibility that people can work, at least some Americans. They cannot work. They're actually precluded from working in the jobs that they're in. Well, before the pandemic, there are millions of Americans who are also unable to work for a variety of reasons. So that narrative of when people are deserving of getting services and getting cash is really important. So that's the work we have to do. The narrative work is really huge. And I'm not going to say that's easy, but we have to really think about that as a way to move this work forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for a wonderful presentation. As always, your work is really, really inspiring. So I appreciate you sharing. Okay, we'll move on to Suki. Suki, would you like to share your screen or would you like me to share yours?
You can share yours.
Okay. Okay, so Suki joins us from the SEED project in Stockton, which is the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, and she's the director. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Natalie and Anne, for providing the context and the framing, and for all your guys' thought partnership on SEED. So I'll start today with just a little bit of context on Stockton and sort of why we decided to launch a guaranteed income there, then talk about the results that we've seen from the program so far, focusing on the spending data. So if you want to go to the next slide. So some context on Stockton. It's a city that's about an hour and a half away from San Francisco, but the reality is about world's difference. We are historically a city that people have run away from rather than to. We were hit really hard by the 2009 recession, and poverty rates have been high since. Today, pre-COVID, obviously, the median household income was just $46,000. Nearly a quarter of Stocktonians lived in poverty, and our citywide unemployment rates hovered at around 7%. So this is even before the COVID crisis struck. Stockton was a city with a lot of need, and we knew that this poverty was at the crux of every other issue that the city faced, whether it was homelessness, poor educational outcomes, etc. So we knew that to address the rest of the ecosystem of issues, we would have to really look at the issue of poverty itself. And what better way to do that than to really get at the root cause of it, which is a lack of cash itself. Next slide. So SEED, it's 125 residents, $500 per month, 18 months, with an exciting announcement later today that we've actually been able to extend to 24 months. So our last disbursement will, instead of July 2020, will now be in January 2021. So we're super excited to share that news today. The next slide. So in terms of how folks were selected, all of our selection criteria and process were informed by a deep community engagement process. One of our core values is that this is research with Stockton, not research on. So really trying to reverse the trend of research being exploitative, especially in communities of color, especially amongst marginalized cities like Stockton. So a really simple selection criteria: people had to be 18 years of age or older, and they had to live in a neighborhood where the median income is at or below $46,000. So we were able to, as you can see from the map, get most of the neighborhoods in the city, and so we were really able to capture a diverse sample as well. Then from there, the selection process, because we are also a research component, everything we did conduct this as a randomized controlled trial. So we sent letters to 4,000 randomly selected households in Stockton located in the qualifying neighborhoods. And then from there, folks who responded were put into either a treatment group or two of our control groups. Next slide. And then our program has three core pillars: research, storytelling, and community engagement. For the sake of this presentation, I'll just focus on the research, but as you heard from Anne and Natalie, the narrative piece is really, really important, and we've leaned into it, allowing our recipients to tell their stories themselves. And the community engagement, again, making sure that we're doing this with Stockton, not on Stockton, so being really intentional about taking everything from our data to the curriculum that we're designing to the community before we share it worldwide or nationally. So on the research front, next slide. As I said, we are an RCT with a mixed methods design. We have a treatment group and a control group as well. And our research questions actually do focus on the health impacts and the public health impacts of a guaranteed income. So key question is, how does a guaranteed income impact income volatility? And then to what degree do changes in income volatility then impact your physical and emotional well-being? Are you happier? Are you less stressed? Are you less anxious? And then how do those things impact the way that you're showing up in the world? Next slide. So in October 2019, we released the first wave of data, and we launched our community data dashboard that showed demographic information as well as high-level spending data. And we found two key things. The first was that, as we've intuitively known to be true, people are working, but the economy isn't. Pre-COVID, 43% of our recipients were employed full or part-time, 20% were disabled, not working, 11% were caretakers, which is a form of work primarily done by women of color that was not recognized by our formal economy. Then 11% were looking for work. Less than 2% of our recipients were unemployed and not looking for work. And despite all of this employment data, we saw that the median household income per month before SEED was just $1,800. So again, people are working, the economy isn't, and the $500 a month ends up being a nearly 30% increase for folks. So really, this data, I think, really answers two questions and two critiques that we get. One, if you give people money, they're going to stop working. Clearly was not borne out in the data. And two, is $500 really that much? Well, in a city like Stockton, it's a lot. Next slide. And the other key finding around the data was that because our recipients are people just like you and I, they're spending the money like you and I would. Pre-COVID, 40% of the track spending was on food, 22% on sales and merchandise, 10% on auto care. And then we were also able to look at spending just from February and March of 2020, so the months leading up to the pandemic. And we saw that how a guaranteed income allows people to weather the pandemic, with food spending peaking at 46.5% of total spending in March of 2020. And that's the very blue column on the right. Yeah, that one. Next slide. And then I will end with a quote. This is, again, before COVID, and we have gotten more texts from folks over the course of a couple of months about how much having a guaranteed income has allowed them to really weather this crisis, especially as they're losing jobs. But also going back to sort of the more human impacts of it, and the ways in which people are able to see the effects beyond just finances. One of our recipients said, I have more family time, I get to read bedtime stories and find out what the kids did at school, the stuff that's really important. This is a sentiment that's been echoed from a lot of our folks about being able to be better partners and parents, and really, I think, speaks to the ways in which $500 a month allows us to really do the human things that make us happy. And so we're really excited that we were able to extend the pilot for an additional 6 months so that we can keep hearing stories like these. And with that, I think that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, and congratulations. It's super exciting. So I think we had a couple seconds for this question, so I'll just ask it to you, Suki. What are we learning from these pilots? Example, increased housing and food security, health outcomes, income security is extremely stressful, so there's no doubt that the quality of life would improve, but are there any objective criteria being measured?
Sure. So I mentioned it on this slide briefly about our research question. So what we're specifically measuring is how a guaranteed income impacts income volatility. With the rise of the gig economy, with a decrease in worker protections, we're seeing income volatility increase with unstable schedules, folks not being able to actually know how much money they're going to bring in. So how does getting $500 a month, can it stabilize that? And then how do changes in income volatility in turn impact financial well-being, psychological distress, and physical functioning? The mechanics of the surveys and our research are available on our website, but we're borrowing from surveys like the Kessler 10, et cetera, to really answer those questions. And I know maybe Natalie or Anne can speak to this, but the Magnolia Mothers Trust this time is also coupled with research questions. And I know that there's a host of other pilots that are being done, coupled with research that are all trying to build upon each other to answer the questions of how guaranteed income impacts people on different populations.
Great. We will ask you one more question, and I know you have to hop off in 3 minutes. Are there any basic income pilots tied to reduced work week or work hours? There are just a couple of us in this conversation from the economic development world. We are looking at the state of California's work-share program as a recovery option for workers with reduced hours. And I'm wondering if guaranteed income can be tied to extending that so that workers can have shorter weeks.
I think Natalie might be better positioned to answer this question.
So I don't know of any that are explicitly tied to working less. That sounds like the greatest pilot that I could not have imagined happening in America, like given our politics of the dignity of work on both sides of the aisle. And I think that, but the question makes me think, God, times have totally shifted. Like, I think people understand now that, a 4-day work week would make a lot of sense. So anyway, I think that in some ways, all the pilots are doing that. Sort of what Suki was getting at with time, that so many people were able to quit their third job, sometimes their second or their third job, and use that time with their children instead of the hustle that we demand you have in America in order to make it. And so in some ways they're all sort of getting at that, but I would love to see something explicit. I think that would be very, very powerful.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Any one last question maybe? We have 2 minutes. For Suki. Someone asked about funding, Suki. I don't know if that's an easy one to take.
Sure, we are fully philanthropically funded. The Economic Security Project gave us our seed donation of $1 million, which is actually funding the disbursements, and then a host of other foundations have come in to support that.
including Robert Wood Johnson, for folks who live at this intersection of health and wealth. And that they were very interested specifically in this question: how will the health incomes, or what will the health outcomes be of cash? And so just sort of, to the conversation we're all having today and that many of you live in, I think that that is increasingly the space. And all of these right now are funded philanthropically. There's some major donors, a lot of foundations, and then I think we're just beginning to see the first public dollars put toward this work. Santa Clara County just greenlit a pilot with foster youth transitioning out of the foster program to receive a stipend with no strings attached to get on their feet. And I'm excited to see how that grows as well. So much of this is happening in California. And it's really, hopefully so goes California, so goes the nation.
Awesome. Well, I think, Suki, you have to hop off, so I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing these exciting updates. Best of luck with the extended timeline.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Okay, I will transition back to my original slides. And I know folks have been asking more questions on the chat, and we'll get to all of those during our Q&A after Larissa goes. Bear with me for just a moment. And Larissa, I'm assuming you want me to also share your slides?
Yes, please. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And as you get those up, I'll just say, because I know we want to make sure there's enough time for questions. Thank you to the team at BARHII and Rise Together for having me today and putting forth this really important and timely conversation. I think there's no better time than now to really start talking about the opportunity of guaranteed or universal basic income. And I'm really the new kid on the block. I feel like over the last year, I've talked to my colleagues really in theory about how universal basic income can work. And it was really with the pandemic where, we've just kind of launched into this discussion at All in Alameda County. And, as I work to figure out how do we do something like this at the local level, I actually reflect upon a note I found from my grandmother that she sent me in 2004, which included a little check when I was in graduate school. And she wrote something to the effect of, "This is just a little something I know you could use." And that's exactly what this is we know people could use this idea of baseline resilience and a baseline economy. And just like, I keep coming back to that. And so as I listen to Anne and Natalie and Suki, like it just kept, my grandmother kept speaking to me and like, this is just a little something I know you can use. So next slide, please.
And I want to introduce you real quick, Larissa.
Oh,
I realized that I forgot to
Sorry.
introduce you. So Larissa is joining us from All in Alameda County, and she's executive director. Do you want to say a little bit about All in?
Sure. All In was founded in 2014 by Alameda County Supervisor Wilma Chan, really as the new war on poverty at the 50th anniversary of Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty. And initially founded as an initiative under the supervisor, it's since been embedded in the county administrator's office and also is connected to the board of supervisors as a committee of the board. Our steering committee serves as a committee of the board of supervisors. And so a really interesting dual reporting structure where we have potential to impact immediate needs, looking at basic needs, as well as the idea of education and economic opportunity, working towards self-sufficiency for Alameda County families. And so really excited to be here and really excited to be really part of this conversation and learning a lot just from listening. And so thank you, Asma.
Awesome, thank you. I will move to the next slide.
And this is just an overview of Alameda County and the widening poverty gap. And this is, of course, pre-COVID data. And, as we know, this poverty gap is continuing to increase just given with the coronavirus pandemic, and the issue continues to grow. And I think something that I have to say out loud, and especially given the week that many of us have seen and experienced, is that poverty, and particularly concentrated poverty, is created by design and by historical racist and discriminatory practices that has really embedded particularly communities of color into severe economic crisis that continues to grow right now. And I feel like I have to say that just because that's what we're seeing and that we're experiencing. And it's just sure and pure desperation that we see many of our families in. The idea that you need over $92,000 to survive in Alameda County is just beyond ridiculous right now. And I think, you know, for many of those who live in the county, a lot of us are on the fringe. You know, I think we're all just one medical emergency away from being in poverty, and people have to recognize and acknowledge that. I think nobody is really insulated. There are very few of us that are actually insulated from all this. Next slide, please. This is really just a bit of background on All In. Really, our focus is on eradicating poverty in Alameda County through collaboration and innovation. We are a multi-sectoral initiative that really focuses on the institutionalized policies and practices. How do we engage and intentionally engage community in the discussion to advance what are community's priorities? Through this, we can foster sustainability and stability amongst communities. And really, how do we focus on heritage and cultural practices and mitigate the displacement that we are currently seeing, particularly in the East Bay and the Bay Area? We want to see a county without poverty and communities that are thriving, resilient, and prosperous. Next slide, please. You know, we saw this pandemic as an immediate threat to already vulnerable communities. And we see this particularly in unincorporated Alameda County, where there was the highest poverty rates and unemployment rates. We just learned that one of the unincorporated areas, Cherryland, which sits between Hayward and San Leandro, you know, is featuring a 25% unemployment rate right now. And, you know, we've been talking about and hearing about this idea of flattening the curve, but when you flatten the curve, you're actually we're seeing the increase of food insecurity, of housing insecurity, and unemployment. And, you know, where we sit as All in Alameda County, we really struggled in the wait and the continued wait to see kind of what happens at the federal level, what happens at the state level, knowing that some sort of formal response is actually leaving people out. And, you know, we really do applaud many of the elected officials that have come out and created and implemented these gap policies like eviction moratoriums. But, you know, a concern continues to kind of come to the surface for me is what happens when the 30 days, the 90 days, 120 days are up. And what if you were already struggling prior to that stopgap? You know, this really is a huge call to action. And I think the time to innovate really is now. Next slide, please. So recognizing the need and anticipating the growing need, this is late March. You know, we started shopping the idea on cash assistance. You know, how could we, particularly with Alameda County, given that we are the safety net system for the unincorporated areas, how could we impact individuals and small businesses? And as we started to have those conversations, you know, this idea of the greater good and how you can have broader and bigger impact started to come up. And for many elected officials and their staffers, it really became, how do we find this sweet spot between cost and impact? And that's, you know, Natalie, you brought this up. This is a really big deal with the local level and the economic crisis that is really in front of us. It's understandable that elected officials are really thinking about a more conservative approach. As we started to think about this idea, we learned about existing efforts, and I'm learning about more now just today, and also about what are some previous attempts. There was in 2018, there was a proposed pilot in Oakland that didn't seem to get off the ground by Y Combinator. And I haven't been able to find out kind of the what happened behind it. But but there have been conversations locally, and there's at least one that I'm aware of that's a cash assistance by RCD Housing, where they were providing some cash assistance, small amount of cash assistance, particularly for undocumented, and others that were kind of left out of some of the stimulus packages. Next slide, please. So we started to think about, well, what could a proposed intervention look like? And let me just say that we haven't gotten anything off the ground yet. So this is all still very much proposed and really continuing to flesh out the idea. But at the end of the day, you have to start somewhere and start to generate the conversation, particularly amongst our public, nonprofit, and philanthropic partners. And it's been really our public, these three sets of partners that have been open to thinking this through. And when we thought about it, we were thinking about, could it be a 3-month pilot? And this is back in March, not knowing kind of where the pandemic curve was going to go and hit. And, hearing that Stockton is extending their pilot to January, an additional 6 months, really gets me thinking that this is something that needs to be a little bit more longer term, and that 3 months really isn't going to cut it. And, whenever we get this vaccine, or if it's herd immunity, whatever it is, economic recovery is still going to take time. Jobs just don't come online right after a vaccine hits the streets. This takes time. And so being really mindful of that. We were looking at $1,000 just because of the cost of living in the Bay Area. We've played around, and you'll see on the next slide a cost calculator we've come up with, just to see kind of where could we hit, and where does this, again, it's about cost, and how do you fund something like this. Tremendously supportive of the idea that it's got to be flexible. Families have to be able to use it. They deserve the dignity and the agency to be able to make choices. If it is purchasing goods such as clothes, it's okay. If we have that same level of dignity, others are deserving of that level of dignity as well. But many actually make choices that are related to food, are related to housing. I think the data from Stockton on auto care is really important, as many people need transportation to get to and from work, to support their kids' transportation to school. So I thought, that was a really important thing, I think, to key in on. And finally, ensuring that folks are connected to existing resources that, do have sustained funding, whether it be CalFresh, Medi-Cal, other workforce development, other types of assistance, but also ensuring, and this is something that we're continuing to think about, is how do we not, how does a cash benefit or some sort of cash assistance not impact their existing safety net resources that they may already receive? Next slide, please. So playing with cost. It really, we started getting the big question, well, how do you pay for something like this? We're cash strapped, or, we're already operating in a deficit. And when it came to balancing, how do you increase the size of the population? You, of course, increase the cost. And so we actually worked with some colleagues to develop a cost calculator, where we would play around with how much money, how many number of months, if we're looking at percentage of the population. And as you can see on this slide, the cost quickly grew. And I think something else that's really critical is the importance of evaluation behind this, and really looking at the impacts on the health and well-being of folks that would participate in some sort of cash assistance program, and really just the quality of life outcomes. And so being able to staff some sort of fund like this is critical to ensure that it's managed appropriately, as well as you're able to get the outcomes that you really do need. Next slide, please. So, of course, as the conversation is continuing in Alameda County, we've had to make adjustments. We've started to talk about more concrete populations like unaccompanied minors, youth transitioning from the justice system, families with children under 5, funding sources. How, again, we keep coming back to how do we fund this kind of stuff. A big innovation, I think, is really how do we get funds to families quickly? And this is something that the bureaucratic nature with the checks and balances of a county we have to figure that out. It can't be something where we go through an invoicing process and a check is cut and it takes 4 to 8 weeks for something like this to happen. Families need assistance now. And, you know, there's conversations about how does electronic transfer apps like a Cash App, a Venmo, how could something like that come into play? Is it the reloadable debit cards? So again, these continuing conversations, they help shape what we're looking to try to do in Alameda County. And finally, the need to change the narrative. And Natalie, you both brought this up. This is not a handout, it's a lift up, and especially during difficult times. And what we know is that families want to be self-sufficient, but it really does depend on opportunity and access, which is often disproportionate in low-income communities of color. And guaranteed cash assistance programs can help shift, and the research behind them can help shift and change that narrative. Next slide. Natalie, you mentioned the Santa Clara County pilot. This was passed maybe 2 weeks ago. This is brand new and right hot off the press. And it really stemmed from a presentation back in December of 2019 to the county supervisors in Santa Clara County. And this is just a little background on the pilot that I don't know when it will launch, but I know it is a 1-year pilot. And, you know, I think there's more to come from local jurisdictions that are really, you know, stepping up and taking a shot at meeting particular vulnerable populations where there is a huge need. So kudos to Santa Clara County for moving forward on something like that and really setting the tone for the Bay Area on how we can make something like this happen. Next slide, please. So the journey continues, the need grows. I don't think we can ignore the lines that are growing at many food bank and pantry distributions. We're continuing to explore what a small pilot could look like. We're challenged with how do we meet immediate needs, but also how are we thinking about this long-term strategy that both Anne and Natalie have raised. And it can't be just a 3-month thing. I think families were strapped before, and we really have to be mindful of the long-term economic impacts that we are experiencing due to COVID. We're happy to be part of the conversation and would love to connect with more folks that are out there that are thinking in this way, and how do we actually make something like this happen. And we've seen, again, the pilots move forward. You know, this is the time to innovate. And this is the one time that, again, I think minds are opening and people are willing to listen because they know our economy is not working. People are still in need. Next slide. Political will, I think that's something that's a challenge that I didn't have here, but it's not insurmountable. People are introducing legislation. People are starting to be open to conversation about this. But I still think it's critical that we look at project like the SEED project and how they were able to develop trust within the community and really work with the community on the SEED project. And we've got to figure out, what does this mean long term? How do we sustain something like this long term? What is the role of local, state, and federal government in working together for something like this? Next slide. I think in terms of opportunities for collaboration, not just within public health and community organizations, but across sectors, we really have to talk about how do we better share data. You know, much of this is data driven, much of the political will is data driven, and so we've got to get better on sharing data and sharing timely data. It's going to take multi-sectoral solutions. Poverty wasn't created by one sector, and guaranteed income won't be solved, or the implementation of guaranteed income can't come from one sector alone. It really has to be multi-sectoral. And how do we transition folks to again, those other safety net systems, and how do we streamline the eligibility processes for connecting into those systems? I think we make things very difficult, and you talked about the deservedness, and these systems that we have in place get in the way of that. And so how do we really identify those quality improvement opportunities to streamline? Next slide. And, I'll just end with this quote. I think one of the biggest challenges to society is the way we work will likely disappear in the next 50 years. We need to start talking about universal basic income. Well, it disappeared about 9 weeks ago. So the next 50 years is off the block. But, again, I go back to what is our response? How do we support communities in recovery, and how do we support communities in developing resistance? And going back to my grandmother, it's just a little something I know you could use. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And I know there's limited time, so if we need to open it up more broadly, we can do that as well.
That's okay. I think we can take one or two specific questions for Larissa, and then we can transition to open it up. Any specific questions for Larissa?
Actually, I'm Paula Baker from Santa Clara County Public Health Department, but I have lived and worked in the Midwest and in Washington, D.C., in the state of Washington on these issues for many years. And one of the questions I have, I'm sorry I was not able to be part of the earlier webinar. So if this is a subject that was covered, just let me know and I'll quit talking. But my question is, has it come up to combine the basic income concept with some other evidence-based programs to end income inequality that have been successful in the past? One program in particular is called the Assets for Independence program. It operated from the late 1990s to, I hope it's still operating, I don't know, but probably up till 2006. And it was a federal program. There was about $500 million allocated for local grants to nonprofits to encourage nonprofits to raise money at the local level to provide financial literacy and asset development assistance to low-income families and individuals. And that $500 million was to be matched at the local level. And in some cases, that $1 would be matched to $3. And so it would triple the amount of money that would be available for participants. And it was based on a theory out of Washington University in St. Louis that it's not just income inequality, but it is also asset inequality that keeps people in generational poverty. And so that the goal of the program was to assist families and individuals to acquire assets. It could be, a well-maintained used car, a new car. It could be saving money for educational expenses to send your first child off to college, or to send yourself back to school so you could earn more money, or to save for a down payment on an affordable home in conjunction with an affordable lending programs. But that would be one way to, this is just phenomenal that at this time, California and the Bay Area is part of implementing this basic income concept. And this would be a way also to kind of build on some of the successes of the past to even maximize the impact even more. I would say if the program doesn't exist any longer at the federal level, it could also be a program that could be put in place at the state level, or but it was a successful program. And another program that I helped to implement highly successfully. Well, actually, there are people who went through both these programs who are now even state legislators. so I'm just thrilled. But there was another program I did help to implement in the state of Minnesota, which was called the Supported Work Program. And that took money, you might have heard of it before, but it took money that was left over at the manpower, at the end of the Manpower Administration, which was at the end of the War on Poverty. And it took money and established some pilot or demonstration projects. And this one was the most successful, especially in employing women of color who were heads of households. And it was called the Supported Work Program. And in Minnesota, I work for the Council on Black Minnesotans. We were able to get legislation passed with the support of the business community. And we also got a federal waiver of regulations to implement it. But we were able to establish a program that provided support. Yeah, I'm just going on too long, but anyway, we used the model, which had coaching on the job, off the job, you know, a variety of incentives, housing vouchers, automobile loans, and to help women, and primarily women, because we were looking for a program that met the needs of women so that they could get into a job that paid enough to cover their cost of childcare. You know, and long story short, but that program ran for years and years and years and supported and helped so many women and families. But it was based on this highly successful model called Supported Work. And in Minnesota, they've used both models, both programs. So that's another idea that could be combined with the basic income concept and maximize so that whatever resources, I see someone's talking about the IDA, AFI. Yeah, good point. All right.
Panelists have a comment to add to Paula's or respond?
What did you say?
I'm asking the panelists if they had a response to what you were sharing. I think those are all great examples of how we can
Paula,
combine.
I think what you're bringing up is that there are many different historical successes in looking at asset building and economic and opportunity amongst community. And I think there are lessons to be learned from all of them. And I think you have to know where you came from to know where you're going. And I think that's the beauty of this conversation right now is it's sharing those resources that are out there as well as opportunities for learning, so that for someone like me that's trying to figure out how do I make this happen or how do we make this happen, you know, pulling those lessons learned into growing something that can be built upon in the future.
Great, yeah, thank you, Larissa. I see that Estelle had something. Thank you.
We have just a few moments left and I want to be mindful of folks' time. Thank you so much, Paula, for sharing those reflections.
You're welcome.
We had quite a few questions come up, so I'm going to try and field as many as possible. And for those questions that we don't get to, I'll make sure that our panelists get them and then we can circle back with responses for you all. So one of the questions that we got is, have any of the panelists been working to get buy-in or support from tech companies with more automation and tech advances in the future, more lower income jobs will be made redundant?
So yeah, I would argue that is how the conversation, that was like the early frame for this conversation of a universal basic income was very much fear of the future, fear of like the impact of technological advancement on the workforce. And one of the shifts I think that leaders like Anne and Mayor Tubbs and Stockton and Suki, you know, who we just heard from, have made, is that we know we don't have to predicate our arguments for an idea like this on some unknowable future that's debated. We can look just at the here and now in the last 50 years of neoliberal capitalism to make the case that everyone should have a guaranteed income. And that I think is a bit of a difference. And I think also like that's what's winning out. I mean, that's what's being discussed right now in Congress, is the here and now. We don't pass policy on something that may happen in the future. Unfortunately, it's just not we don't have the long-term, thinking to do something like that. But we can't, but we can here and now. So all that to say, we believe tech companies should play a role in supporting this kind of work, but it really should be led by the social justice leaders who are doing the work. And so to that end, a bunch of, there are folks in tech who fund this, who fund the Stockton project, who fund some of the demonstrations. But it's not really the dominant, I think I would say it's a portion of the funding, but it's also, traditional foundations and those who have been working on poverty for a long time.
Great, thank you. One other question we have is, and I saw that you started to respond to this over the chat, so let me know if you want to talk more to it. How can these guaranteed income discussions / projects for people of color be connected to discussions of reparations? And I think you're muted.
Still muted. Okay.
Okay, am I off of mute?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. I basically responded by talking about reparations being more closely tied to wealth extraction and wealth than it is income. There have been proposals to think about providing additional cash to Black folks, for example, as a form of reparations. I even think that Dorian, who actually initiated that idea, has actually moved away from it a bit. So I really think about reparations more connected to wealth. What I do think is that we can look at a guaranteed income or cash in more targeted ways to deal with very specific issues that affect people of color, and think about how it could actually help people hold on to assets, for example, and not lose them when they have an emergency or a job loss. So I see reparations as kind of a bigger and different conversation that's not necessarily tied to a guaranteed income.
Great, thank you. We'll do one more question and then we will close out for today. So one question that we have is, have folks been thinking about training portions of the population to be staffed on some of these programs?
Well, we have a number of city and county and state officials who reach out and ask, sort of like what else is going on, and do we track a lot of the pilots? And I think one thing this makes me think is we should, create sort of a listserv or something where people can be connected to others. Back in the days when we convened, we had brought together some of the pilots happening the year before last. So there were probably 20 across the country who were doing cash transfers at the time, with the explicit goal of trying to move policy. But I don't know of any trainings beyond that. Does anyone else?
I don't.
Great, and I see that there's some interest in sharing that listserv or information on how to get involved in that listserv. Natalie, if that's possible, I can circulate that later.
Yeah.
Okay, we're at time. I'm sorry, we're a little over, and I know there's a handful of questions that we didn't get to, and I promise I'll circulate that to all of our speakers today. Thank you to our speakers for all of your time and sharing your expertise and your really exciting projects. I hope everybody benefited from the presentations. We will be circulating the resources after today, so that includes slides, hopefully a recording as well. We've been recording, and anything else that the speakers decide that is helpful for you all. So thank you. I hope everyone stays safe, and we will see you all at another webinar, hopefully very soon. We do have another webinar coming up tomorrow, actually. I'll just put a plug in for that. It's around new powers for counties and enacting emergency paid sick leave. So for more information, we can send an email out as well. Thank you, everybody.